chose them, and when they had been chosen, they would be brought up here before the steps, which lead into the temple. You see, the house. And then, when he'd done that, he would take some incense, and also he would take some coals from the altar, and he would go into the Holy of Holies, and he would light the incense from the coals which he had taken from the altar.
So the Holy of Holies was the innermost of the two chambers here,
yes.
behind the great curtain, the veil.
Yes.
I understand.
Yes. And then, after he'd done that, he would take the goat that was for God, and he would slaughter that goat, and he would take the blood, and then he would hand that to his attendant, who would take care of the blood and see that the blood didn't curdle, and so that it would be, he would be able to sprinkle it when he needed to do so, you see.
Right.
And then when he'd taken that, he would then take the next bull, which was for the people.
Okay.
That was for, the first bull was for the priesthood and for himself, and the second bull was for the people. And he would slaughter that, and then he would take the blood. And he would take the blood, and then he would mix it with the blood of the goat, you see. And then he would take that into the holy place, where he would sprinkle the blood. And he would sprinkle the blood 7 times.
In the Holy of Holies?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, he would sprinkle the blood 7 times in the Holy of Holies. And this, and then he would come out.
Just 1 second. Before he came out, this business of sprinkling. Now, I'm sure that you've told me before that the Ark of the Covenant was no longer there.
No.
So there was no mercy seat,
No.
which represented the presence of God.
No.
So what was he doing sprinkling it on a rock in there if there was no Ark?
Well, there was no ark, you see, so it's quite obvious he couldn't sprinkle the blood as it should have been sprinkled on the ark.
So was it effective in their eyes?
Well, I can't really think that it could have been effective.
Yeah.
But as far as they were concerned, the rabbis were always devising ways of overcoming certain obstacles which presented themselves in the temple, which didn't exactly comply with the law of Moses.
Right.
Because the Ark of the Covenant wasn't there, this was the method they used.
Yes, I see. Okay.
Yes, and then you see he would sprinkle the blood, and of course when he came out, he would have then come to the goat that was left, one slaughtered, and the blood sprinkled, which was a sin offering in itself. But the goat that was left was also a sin offering, but it was a special sin offering in that it was sent away into the wilderness. It would have been sent out through this gate, through the court.
This is the scapegoat.
Yes.
Ah, right.
And it would have gone out that gate, and we can see it actually going out there with the red ribbon round its head, and taken out this gate onto the Mount of Olives, and then it would have been released in the wilderness where it would have wandered off to die, carrying away the sins of the people.
My. Well, that's remarkable.
Yeah, and this is the only, one of 3 sacrifices that were actually offered, as it were, outside the temple.
Right.
There was the bird of the leper.
Now, I've never heard of that. What's that?
Well, when a leper was cleansed, he had to come to a priest in order to be qualified as being clean, and after the examination there was a prescribed sacrifice and ceremony which involved 2 birds, and the procedure was very similar to the scapegoat. The 2 birds, one was let go and one was killed, but in that case the one that was killed, it was outside, it was buried before the blood was sprinkled from the bird that was killed onto the bird that was let go. For cleanliness, you see. And then this would be outside the camp, outside the city walls. And then after 7 days, the man had to come back to the priest to be examined again to make sure. And then if he was declared clean, he would then come into the temple and go through another elaborate ceremony in this building here, which is the chamber of the lepers.
I see. Gosh.
And the other sacrificed outside the temple would have been the red heifer.
Alec, where is the red heifer referred to in the Bible?
Well, we read about it in the Old Testament, in
Yeah.
Numbers 19.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
And what exactly was the red heifer used for?
Well, it was a peculiar sacrifice that was sacrificed outside the temple. It was taken out the eastern gate to a site on the Mount of Olives, a special site, and it was slaughtered, and then it was burnt completely. Every part of it was burnt. And when it was burnt, the ashes were beaten with sticks, and then they were put into jars with water, and then they were stored. There were usually 3 jars. How large these jars were, I don't really know. They must have been quite big. And one jar was left on the Mount of Olives, and one jar was just outside that gate there, and the other jar was inside the temple. And this ashes from the red heifer was used for sprinkling of people who had become defiled through contamination of death.
I see.
And this especially applied to the priests, you see, and it would have been a special ceremony for the priests who would sprinkle themselves. In actual fact, they would just take a finger and thumb and a little bit and sprinkle.
So it lasted a long time?
Yes, it would provide purification, you see.
So that presumably meant they didn't have to do this very often?
Oh no, it was only if they come in contact. I mean, one instance which we could think of is in the parable of the Good Samaritan and the priest who come across the person who he thought might be dead, you see. He wouldn't go anywhere near him because of uncleanliness.
Oh, I see.
Yes.
So the number of red heifers which were killed, is pretty small.
Oh yes, it would be under 10.
Under 10 in what sort of period?
Oh, this would be from the beginning of the time of Moses.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, up until this temple, which would have been the 1st century, you see.
Oh, I say, all that time, only 10 of them were
yes,
killed?
Yes, only 10 of them were killed.
So a little went a long way?
A little went a long way, yes.
Very good.
And so the goat would be led out through the court of the women, and then it would be led out the eastern gate. The eastern gate would be not necessarily where people would enter or leave, but it would be used mainly for sacrificial purposes. This would be where the red heifer would be taken out, and just various other ceremonies would take place, and this would be, and we can see the scapegoat as it is going out there.
Oh, right.
to be led out over
Indeed.
the Mount of Olives and to let go and to take away the sins of the people.
So it just wandered off into the wilderness and perished, I suppose?
Yes,
As a symbol of God's
yes,
atoning grace and the sins of the people being taken away.
yes. So
amazing.
So it would be let go, and when the goat was let go on the Mount of Olives, they would signal back to the high priest that when the goat was actually departed, then the high priest would be able to carry on with the rest of the day's sacrifices. There were various other sacrifices which took place involving lambs and rams and another goat, which was another sin offering. But then when all these had been completed, you see, he would come to the steps here, and then he would conduct a service, standing from these steps, and the people would be standing here, and they would read parts of the scripture, and they would sing psalms, and when they sung psalms, you would see the Levites would stand. There would be at least 12 or even more. It says in the Mishnah, 12 or priests without number.
My goodness.
So you see there are 12, and in front of them would stand the young Levites who would be trained to sing, and they would sing, and the singing, the real praise was from the lip alone. The trumpets and the musical instruments, the trumpets were signalling devices, and the musical instruments for merrymaking, but praise came from the lip alone. And when you stop and think about it, there is nothing to compare with the human voice. And when we think of the Levites with the rich, deep tones, and the young men harmonising and singing.
Wonderful.
It would be
Absolutely wonderful.
the music of the temple was something which was outstanding in the ancient world. And as they sang the verses, and the people would respond at the end of each line with hallelujahs. And so he would do the reading and the service. And this is how the day would be concluded. Of course, when this was finished, the evening sacrifice would be sacrificed, you see.
So the place was packed with Jewish pilgrims, obviously, because this was the most important day of the year in a certain sense.
Yes.
So this area, the court of the women would be full, obviously,
Yes.
and then the court of the men, but also, presumably, around here, the court of the Gentiles would have been thronged with pilgrims as well, trying to get as close as possible.
And also, you see, the altar, there were normally 2 fires burning on the altar, but on the Day of Atonement, all 4 fires were lit.
Well, that's interesting, you see, because without seeing your model here of the 4 fires, in my mind, I would always have thought of there being just the one.
Yes. Well, in actual fact, there were 2 for sacrificing on normal occasions. There was always one kept in reserve in case those 2 went out.
I see.
But on the Day of Atonement, all 4 fires were lit. And of course, when we think of the number of burnt offerings, which were devotional offerings, which had to be completely burnt, we understand that on the Day of Atonement, why it was necessary to have these 4 fires burning.
Absolutely. Now, Alec, before we leave the Day of Atonement, there's one question I want to ask, well, 2 actually, related to the high priest coming out of the Holy of Holies. One concerning the veil of the temple, this curtain.
Yes.
Now, the common idea would be of the high priest coming out and simply moving aside the curtain and walking through. But this was a sheer impossibility, wasn't it? Because of the hugeness of the thing.
Oh, yes.
Well, exactly how big was it?
It was made up of 72 squares woven by the women who were on the temple site continually weaving, and each square would be approximately 1.5 meters or about 4 foot square. All their measurements are given in cubics, and they would all be sewn together, and this would produce a veil of 60 feet high by 30 feet wide.
I mean, that's astonishing, isn't it?
Yes, and it would be
weight
enormous.
of that.
And in order to get it in place, it couldn't be done by hand. And above the Holies of Holies were openings.
Was there a winch or something?
Yes, there were winch and openings in order to get it into position. It wouldn't be possible to put ladders and things up. And of course, the veil from time to time would become unclean. I mean, as well as people becoming unclean, vessels could become unclean, and articles and clothing, and they had to be immersed. And if the veil become unclean, supposing an insect or something was found crawling up the veil, it would then be rendered unclean.
Oh my goodness.
And it would have to be taken out and immersed.
And so another one would have to be put
another
there.
one would have to put in.
And that's why the women working in this little factory over here were in permanent
employment.
There is
always the question of why were there 2 veils. I mean, people say they both hung up there together. Some people say there were one hung alone and there was no other. But in actual fact, there was always one in reserve.
Right.
Because they would put the one up before they took the other one down, so that it wouldn't be left open.
Fascinating.
And it would be taken over to the Pole of Israel, where it would be immersed, and then it would be hung over the porches to dry, and so that the people could see the beauty of it.
My word.
Yes.
Remarkable.
And this is a veil which the high priest which was pulled aside so that he could go in to sprinkle the blood.
But pulled aside with some difficulty, it has to be said.
Yes.
So this enormous thing is very symbolic, isn't it, when you think that it separated the people essentially from the presence of God.
Yes.
And yet it was that veil which was rent in twain, as the AV puts it, torn in two from top to bottom when Jesus died on the cross to open up a way of access to the Father.
The thickness of the veil was very considerable.
Oh, really?
It is stated that it was 4 inches thick, but of course that wouldn't be possible.
4 inches thick?
A hand's breadth. But it wouldn't be that thick, but it would be very, very thick. It would be like a very thick carpet or something like that.
Right, right.
And to think of that being torn from top to bottom.
Well, it's impossible for
Yes,
man to do
yes.
such a thing.
I mean, you couldn't pull it and tear it.
No.
No.
Now, the other thing that fascinates me is that I have heard that when the high priest came out of the Holy of Holies, having made atonement for the people could hear him coming because there were little bells sewn around the hem
Yes.
of his robe. Is that the case?
Well, it may have been the case, but it was also so that when he went in, that his entry would be announced by the sound of the bells, because as we know, should anyone enter actually into the presence of God, that would result in death.
So it was a way of letting the Lord know he was coming.
Yes. But like lots of other things, a lot of these things are the fables of the rabbis.
Right.
How much truth is actually in
Well,
it,
there we are.
we don't know.
Right.
But while he was in there would be absolute silence. The people would face themselves down to the ground, and there would be absolute silence. When we read in Revelations where there was silence in heaven,
Yes.
it's referring to the times when there would have been absolute silence within the temple because
Remarkable.
of what was taking place.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Remarkable. And how all this speaks so much of the Lord Jesus, doesn't it?
Well, yes, it speaks of opening the way
Yeah.
into the presence of God.
Yeah. The high priest
Yes.
going in.
Yes.
Jesus, our great high priest.
Yes.
But so superior in everything.
Oh, yes.
To all of this.
This has to be repeated. The Day of Atonement was repeated every year. The daily sacrifices were repeated every day
Yeah.
in order to find forgiveness, to find acceptance in the sight of God, to find peace with God. This was a continual procedure, and yet it never succeeded.
Never.
No.
But Jesus goes in once
And
for
it's-
all time.
Yes.
Hallelujah.
It's finished.
It's finished. Now, Alec, the activities of the priests here, of course, is fantastic. And clearly, the people were dependent on the priests to a very great extent. And so the priests must have had terrific opportunities to take advantage of that. Was there a lot of corruption in the priesthood?
The corruption in the priesthood was unbelievable.
Really?
Really unbelievable. And I find it very difficult when I research this to understand actually why Jesus would have went to the temple with this corruption going on. But of course he was a very courageous man, and he went and he confronted them. And this would have resulted in his crucifixion, you see.
Yeah, quite.
But the priesthood was such that the people were dependent upon them for their religion. They were dependent upon them in order to come to God. They couldn't come to God without the priesthood, you see. So they had enormous power.
Goodness me.
Yes.
Can you give me some examples as to the way they abused their rights?
Well, you see, this would have been controlled by various people. One of them would, of course, have been Herod, who rebuilt the temple, and the Jews were quite aware of the evil of Herod and his corrupt ways, but he was also very charming and had a way, and he, in the rebuilding of the temple, you see, they didn't really trust him, but in the end he persuaded them. And when he rebuilt the temple, he arranged things so that he would actually get control eventually.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Goodness.
Yes.
So the priests then, the high priest, ended up almost as Herod's puppet in a
Yes,
sense.
yes. One of the things he did, you see, in order to prove your qualifications as a high priest, you have to have a list of your descendants going back as far as possible. I mean, theoretically, it should go back to Aaron.
Right.
But I think they would accept up to about 5 generations. And when Herod rebuilt, he arranged it conveniently so all those records were burned. It was supposed to be an accident, but they were all burned. So nobody would know who the high priests were. And so then that gave him an opportunity to introduce whoever he wished.
Of course.
Yes. And of course, the people who wanted to enter into the priesthood, it became a matter of buying your way in. Because once you were in, you know, you were there and you were made, as they would say today.
Quite so.
Yes.
So how did they actually sort of use their position to suck the money out of the people?
Well, the majority of the priests, and especially, this would apply more to the high-ranking priests. You see, it wouldn't really apply to the low-ranking priests, like people like Zacharias, who had said of him, he was a godly man. And
Quite so.
And although they were corruption, they were also good priests.
Indeed.
And it would apply mainly those who would be Sadducees, the ruling class. And of course, they wouldn't want to lose their position under the Roman Empire, so they would conform to the Roman Empire's ways. And of course, Herod himself was under the authority of Rome. And of course, he arranged it that he installed whoever he wanted, and he could control them, and so that in that way, he could siphon off the money.
I mean, for example, the buying of the sacrificial animals, this was presumably a racket as far as the priests were concerned.
Yes. No, the sacrificial market would be controlled by a high priest by the name of Annas.
Oh, what, the famous father-in-law of Caiaphas?
Yes, yes. And how that would come about was, you see, in the time of Christ, the high priest was only high priest for 1 year.
One? I didn't know that.
Yes, it was.
That was a change, though, wasn't it?
This was because of the Roman authorities wouldn't allow a high priest to be high priest for more than 1 year. And in the time of Moses, of course, the high priest was high priest for life. But you see, Annas, who, as you say, was the father-in-law of all of them and who controlled them all, he arranged it so there would always be a son or a son-in-law or a relative or someone of his. So although they were actually high priest, it would be Annas who controlled it.
Well, I think the fact is that 4 of his sons became high priest, and of course Caiaphas, who was his son-in-law.
Yes, yes.
So he certainly held on to his power behind the throne.
And he would have arranged all that market out there, and they would be selling. And to buy, say if we were buying a sheep in the sacrificial market, it would cost you 5 times what it would cost you in the street market outside.
Oh, I say.
Yes. I mean, there are 2 ways which it could operate. A person could bring one of their own lambs from their own flock, which would be according to the law of Moses, or if they felt they couldn't afford one from this expensive market, the priestly market, they would buy one outside and bring it in. But it would be certain to be disqualified when it was brought before the gate.
Dear. They'd say it wasn't kosher.
Yes, I mean, it could be the most perfect, but they would disqualify it and tell them. And you see, there were lots of people who wanted to come and worship God, but because of their poverty, they couldn't.
Right.
And the priests, who should be comforting the people, bringing peace and helping them in their poverty, instead of that, they were taking advantage of their position.
Just exploiting them.
And then exploiting it. And then again, you see, talking about the market, and also the money changers' tables. Now, there's lots of confusion about this. You see, the Far building is a Roman building, actually. It's an extension to the temple by Herod. And it was mainly concerning trade and commerce. It would more or less be like a high court, houses of parliament and stock exchange all rolled into one. And people would come and there would be big transactions, big business and all that sort of thing. And you would find one of these buildings in every principal Roman town.
Yes.
Yes.
They call it a stoa, I think.
Yes, yes. And people would be carrying on their business. And it's been thought that these were the money changers' tables who Jesus overthrew, but that isn't correct. Because, coming back again, as we were talking before about Passover, the temple tribute had to be paid just before Passover, and it had to be paid in temple currency. And temple currency would be different to any other currency. And it would be no good bringing the equivalent in other currency because they wouldn't accept it.
Oh.
So the priest would set up their tables just inside the temple, which would have been the original temple of Solomon.
Just inside the Holy Gates.
Just inside the Holy Gates.
Mm-hmm.
And the people, as they came, they could change their money. And of course, they wouldn't know the correct rate of exchange. So it gives the priests a golden opportunity. And incidentally, the priests over there wouldn't be dressed in their priestly garments. They would be dressed as... we often hear people say that you can always recognise a priest by the dress, but they were not allowed to leave this area, the sacred area, with their priestly garments on. When they left, they had to return their priestly garments, collect their own garments, and go in their own clothes. So you wouldn't be able to distinguish them from anyone else. But they would be operating the tables there, and that would be when Jesus came in. It wouldn't have happened over there because that wasn't his Father's house. It wouldn't have happened in that courtyard before that because that was just an open public space. And it wouldn't have been until he actually set foot in the temple area, which he said. And he said, "This is my Father's house, and you have made it a den of thieves."
Pretty strong stuff.
Strong stuff to tell priests, isn't it?
I'll say, especially on their own ground.
Yes. And John the Baptist, remember, when they went out to him, he said, "A generation of vipers."
Absolutely.
Which confirms the corruption that went on.
Yeah.
And you see, Christ would come in and he would overthrow the tables because of his disgust with the way in which everything was going on. Also, when the people made a sacrifice, and the animal sacrificed and dissected, the skins were kept.
They weren't returned to the people?
No, they were kept in a chamber here which was called the Chamber of the Skins, where they were flayed and dressed and kept. And then when anyone who wished to make an offering of wine, they could purchase from there again. Of course, if they brought their own, they would be rejected. They would purchase it from there, but it had to be brought in a skin that had been bought from the temple, possibly of an animal which they had given before, you see.
Oh my goodness.
Otherwise it wouldn't be accepted.
Wow.
So this would, you know...
So whichever way you turned, they were making money out of it.
They were making money. They had every advantage. And of course the people were at their mercy. I mean, this would apply to people who came, if they were poor, and they needed forgiveness. Whatever the priest said, they had to obey. Even, you know, just the priest's word was law. There was no courts of appeal. They had to follow what the priest said.
My goodness. Now there was, of course, corruption within the temple building itself, wasn't there, with stuff being siphoned off, as it were, and hidden away for a rainy day? Yes,
well, of course, you see, coming back to Herod, Herod had to maintain favour with Rome in order to keep his position. He also had to pacify the Jewish people. That's why he built the temple. But in order to keep on good terms with the Romans, he would pass over to them huge sums of money from the temple. And of course the ordinary people wouldn't be aware of this. The high priests and the high-ranking priests would, because he would have placed them there. In order to maintain that position, they had to follow his directions.
Like the mafia?
Yes, yes. And inside the temple, the chamber...
Right. Thanks, Coach.
Chambers, which would be the most secure place you could ever think of.
Quite.
No one could actually get in there.
Well, you'd think the only way in was through here.
And the walls were enormous all the way round.
Well, was there some kind of secret passage or something, is it?
Well, when it was stored in this, when the wealth was brought in and taken out from the boxes, and where the tribute, I mean the chamber of the shekel, where the tribute was paid after they'd changed their money, it was all taken into the secure storerooms of the temple itself, where nobody could get them. But there was also underground chambers.
Ah.
Yes. And they were led out through a tunnel that is just here. And that tunnel is still in existence today. It's
My word.
one of the chambers, underground chambers, which is recorded on the temple site. And the tunnel is still there. And it leads through underneath, up into the temple, and right into the chambers where the gold was stored.
My word. And does that tunnel go all the way into the Antonia?
No, we went as far as this.
I see.
But of course it would be easily, and there was an entrance there, you see.
Right.
It would be easy to come in and take the money.
Oh, and creep across there
Yes.
with it.
In the hours of darkness. Lots of things go on in the hours of darkness.
Absolutely, even in the temple.
Yes. And the money would be taken to support armies, to build roads, and all the various schemes that would go on.
So that was all being paid for by the Jewish people without them knowing it.
Yes. Well, only the authorities would know, but
the people themselves had no idea.
Of course, like everything else, you can do something for a little while.
Yeah, true.
But then after a time it becomes knowledge.
Yeah.
And of course this would have resulted finally in the destruction of the temple, in that the loyal Jews, not necessarily the wealthy ones, took over the temple and threw the Sadducees out, you see.
What? Really? When was this? In the late 60s?
This would be just before the destruction, you see. And of course when they were thrown out, they appealed to Rome, because they actually were their bosses.
So there was a kind of people's revolt against the priesthood?
Yes, this is more or less what it would be. And of course Rome came back with a huge army, which of course the people, they had no hope.
So would the Essenes have had any influence on the people over that?
No, they wouldn't. They were completely separate. They didn't mix with the people in the temple.
No, that's what I mean. Would they have stirred up the common people against the corrupt priesthood?
No, I don't think so. It would have mainly been Galileans.
Oh,
Galilee was to Judah
the Zealots,
like Ireland is to England.
Yeah, exactly.
That was the same sort of situation.
Right.
And they would have come and stirred it up.
Aha.
And this would have brought about the destruction, finally, the destruction of the temple, you see.
And of course that would also link in with the fact that the Zealots retreated to Masada,
yes.
And the Romans were so intent on destroying every last one of
yes.
them, because they were the leaders of the revolt then.
Yes.
Oh, how fascinating. Well, Alec, here we are up on the Mount of Olives, looking across the Kidron Valley to the Temple Mount. And right in front of us is the Golden Gate. The curious thing is that much is made of the fact that when the temple stood there, it should actually have all its gates and the Golden Gate in perfect alignment with each other. And the theory is, therefore, that the present location of the Dome of the Rock is too far south. But we notice on your model here that the temple appears to be too far south. Because when we look at the model, there must be, what, 150, 200 feet difference between the alignment of those temple gates and your Golden Gate. Now, I'm sure there's a good explanation, and you're going to give it to us.
Well, there is a good explanation. The trouble is, most people place their assumptions. That is all they are, an assumption that because of ancient religions and beliefs, everything has to line up to the east. And although this is correct in certain cases, it isn't, well, it is correct in the event of this temple, but in as far as the Golden Gate is concerned, the Golden Gate really isn't an entrance gate.
Right, because it's part of the Temple Mount and not part of the temple proper.
Yes. It's rather a special place where sacrifices took place, where certain sacrifices were led out, and which gives it significance. And this also is where priests would stand on certain occasions. If, for instance, if they became unclean, like Zacharias would have when he was struck dumb and he couldn't take part, they would have to stand by this gate while the ceremonies were taking place.
Right. So the idea of the high priest standing there in the entrance to the temple, or rather him standing on the Mount of Olives when the red heifer was killed and needing to see the north side of the altar, this is the puzzle, isn't it? Because how could he look through the Golden Gate and the gates of the temple if they're not in alignment with each other?
Well, the fact is he didn't look through the Golden Gate. The Golden Gate is very often called the Eastern Gate. In fact, many of the gates on the temple have different names and given different names by different people, which sometimes are correct and sometimes are not. Well, in fact, you see, there are several Eastern Gates if we look at them.
Quite.
And the Eastern Gate which they looked through into the holy place would be the gate that stands in the centre, the bronze gate.
Aha.
That would be the Eastern Gate,
Right.
which is being mentioned.
Right, the one that represents the gate of the tabernacle, as
Yes,
it was. I
yes.
understand. And so the high priest could stand on the Mount of Olives, where we are,
Yes.
and look over the first wall, as it
Yes.
were, through that eastern gate and into the holy place.
Yes.
And so the position of the Golden Gate is actually irrelevant.
It's really irrelevant to the alignment. One, because it isn't an entrance going in, and another thing is that it isn't part of what we would call the alignment.
Indeed.
And you see the Eastern Gate, which was in the time of the Tabernacle, the entrance into the Tabernacle, the gate in front of that is also an Eastern Gate. And it says in the Mishnah that the priest looked over the top of that gate, and if you look you'll find that the wall is lower, and the Mishnah says it was lower, so that he could see over the top of that gate, through the other gate,
Yes.
over the top of the altar, and into the holy place.
Well, that's crystal clear from here, isn't it?
Yes.
Splendid. Thank you very much. That clears that one up nicely. Alec, we were talking about the location of the Golden Gate, but how do we know that this is where it was?
Well, the Golden Gate that is there today is a Muslim gate, built in about the 15th century.
Yeah, Suleiman the Magnificent, I
Yes,
think.
that's right. But underneath that structure is another structure, and it belongs to another gate. And there are two stones on that gate at the bottom which have been identified as belonging to the Temple of Solomon. So that locates that position exactly.
I see. Well, that's fair enough.
This is a starting point, you
Right,
see,
right.
in locating the site of the temple.
Right.
And also, we know that the Temple of Solomon stood on a 500 cubic square. And if we can identify one of the corners of that square, it then helps
measure the
us to
others.
measure the rest,
Yeah.
you see. So this, knowing that the Solomon's temple finished here because of the masonry that's been discovered, we know that this corner would be the northeastern corner of Solomon's temple.
Right.
So then all we have to do is to measure down here 500 cubics.
Yes.
Now, nobody knows exactly what 500 cubics is. All the professors have a different cubic to fit their theories. But we'll measure down there roughly 500 cubics and see what we find. And what we find is a bend in the wall.
Oh, really?
Very slight bend in the wall, which indicates that the other piece has been added on at a later date.
Aha.
And you see, so...
Is that reflected in the masonry outside as well?
Yes,
the stones?
yes, it's reflected on the masonry outside if you look.
I can see you've modelled different sized stones down here, so that presumably is where the Herodian wall starts.
Yes, this is where a different period of time, different masonry was added on.
Oh, I
And it
see.
indicates where that corner would have been.
Oh, great. See, I thought you made a mistake there. I didn't like to say anything.
No, yeah, well,
Should have known you too well for that, shouldn't I?
I do make some mistakes, but I correct them before I get the cameras in.
Say no more.
And so,
Great.
again, if we measure, we've measured down there 500 cubics, and we've more or less established what the length of 500 cubics would be.
Right.
So then, if we measure across to that corner, the same measurement, the same 500 cubics, and then again, if we measure back to this corner another 500 cubics, and then
Yes.
draw a line straight through, that should give us the 500 cubic square of Solomon's temple. Now if we put that in place, and then we look at all the various chambers that have been discovered underneath and see how they fit in. Because there are various chambers which have been discovered and which are still in existence today. So if we look at them, we can see if it aligns up and if it actually comes into the place where it should be.
Yes.
So to begin with, there is a chamber here which according to the archaeologist charts is chamber number 3, and that's the remains of an old sacred bath. And then if we move a little further along, we find a tunnel running underneath which is still in existence, which is chamber number 1.
So that's the tunnel you referred to when you were talking about them smuggling the goods
Yes.
out of the temple back
Yes,
to the
yes.
Antonia.
And that lines up with the staircase that goes down where the priest would go down to the, which also connects up with the sacred bath, where the priests who were serving on duty, if they should become defiled, they could quickly go down and wash and return back to their duties, you see. So that lines up with that. And then on the other side, we find where the well is, there is another chamber, and from that, that's a large chamber where all the water is reserved and stored. Actually, it would be surface water, but also from that bridge that goes over the Tabernacle Valley would be an aqueduct, and that would bring in water to fill up these chambers.
So that was a great cistern, was it, basically?
Yes, a great cistern. It was actually called, in the Mishnah, the Great Sea. The name of the chamber was called the Great Sea. And there would be a channel cut from that cistern which leads to exactly beneath that wheel. And that wheel was for drawing up water to fill the laver, which is just here, which was for sacred washing of the priests each day. And of course that would have to be filled up each day, because if there was any left over, it had to be drained away because it would become unclean, and it had to be refilled the next day. So that lines up with that. And then if we move further along, we find 2 more chambers underneath, which were remains of sacred washing, where the people who would be coming into the temple would wash. And of course that all lines up with the tunnel that goes through underneath that leads into the temple. And then another point is, if we move back to here where these steps which lead up to the Dome of the Rock today, the bottom step isn't a step, it's in actual fact a part of an ancient wall. And that wall is believed to be the remains of this wall here, which would have formed the limits of Solomon's temple. So that gives us more evidence of where this 500 cubic square would be on this temple site. And then another point is that this chamber here is where the priests who are on duty would live. And connecting with that would be this chamber which is underneath, where the priest would also go to wash. And there is a staircase which is mentioned in the Mishnah leading down from this corner. And when I built the model, I found out that it lined up exactly and went into this chamber. And then I realized that I had found the exact site of where the Dome of the Rock would be, which would have been inside the temple from this point down inside.
So that's the location of the rock on which the Dome of the Rock has been built?
Yes, that would be right.
So that rock is the rock that the Muslims believe was the jumping off point for Muhammad's horse when he ascended into heaven, which the Muslims believe is located on exactly the same point as that in which Abraham came to sacrifice his son, although in their case, of course, they believe it was Ishmael rather than Isaac.
Yes.
So that ties the whole thing together.
That ties everything together. You see, as we look at the facts that are known, and we look at the chambers that are in existence, and we place everything in accordance with what we have found, this is what we finish up with. And the temple would be in this position, and it wouldn't be in line with that gate.
The Golden Gate?
No, it wouldn't be in line. It would be offset and in fact it would be in line with the site where they sacrificed the red heifer on the Mount of Olives.
Because they have found that location, have they?
Yes, they have found that location.
Right. Our last 3 sessions are really exciting because I've asked Alec if he'll unpack the events that took place here in the temple concerning the Lord Jesus and the first disciples. Well now, Alec, let's begin right at the beginning. An incredibly exciting moment which broke the prophetic silence of 400 years occurred when the Lord spoke to Zacharias. Malachi the prophet was the last of the Old Testament characters to receive revelation from the Lord's word. But now, 400 years later, the voice of God is heard again. It must have been one of those shattering moments in history, but also, of course, an overwhelmingly shattering moment in the life of this poor priest, Zacharias. It happened right here in the temple. So, Alec, tell us about it, please.
Zacharias was an ordinary priest, and the ordinary priests, there was more than was actually needed in the temple, so they would have been divided into 24 different courses.
Right.
And it was arranged so that just an ordinary priest would serve in the temple twice in the whole year.
Okay.
So in between that time, of course, he would be occupied in other things.
So that would be a fortnight straight off?
No, it would be a week, and then away for possibly 6 months, and then another week.
Okay.
And of course he was free to visit the temple whenever he chose amongst the worshippers. And of course they had to be occupied at various things. The most coveted job for a priest would be a stonemason in the temple.
Right.
I mean, we often think today that a priest would be a teacher or something like, clean collar job.
Quite.
But to be a stonemason in the temple, that was really but of course most of them within their own towns, they were scattered all around. Zacharias, he lived in the hill country of Judea, you see, and he would probably teach, act as a rabbi, or teach in the synagogue and so on.
So given that they did 2 weeks in the year, there was nothing to stop a priest living up in Galilee, for example?
Oh no, they lived, the majority of the priests, you see, a priest had to qualify, he had to meet all the requirements of the law.